Hi, I'm John Schroeder, and welcome to another book review on Edgar Cayce, Arizona. The one today is from a favorite author of mine, George G. Ritchie, MD. He's a psychiatrist, passed away back in 2007, but he has what I would call one of the first written accounts of a near-death experience, at least that I've come across. See a picture of him when he was in the military, back there to the left, and a brief description of him. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide and talk about the book Return from Tomorrow. So you see a couple of the highlights there. At age 20, he had a near-death experience. He was actually clinically dead for 9 minutes. And what happened during that 9 minutes is what the book's all about, and it truly guided him for what happened throughout the rest of his life. On the next slide, be able to start the story. You see the two pictures of him over there on the left. That's what he looked like when he was in basic training. And then later on in life, George Ritchie is a psychiatrist and medical doctor, author, lecturer, you name it. He was just a real wonderful Southern gentleman. My wife and I had the pleasure of spending a whole day with him when he came out for a conference to do a conference for the Edgar Cayce volunteer group here in Southern California. I'm in Arizona. But at the time, that's where I was growing up, and he was just a delightful person to get to know. So some of the things that I'll be sharing with you today were from my conversation with him, as well as what you get from the book. Anyway, the story kind of opens up when George enlisted in the U.S. Army. He felt like he wanted to do his part to be able to protect the country. And in fact, his father was also in the military. Remember, this is World War II. So he was defending the country over in Europe at the time. And George already he could have avoided the draft because he was an essential. He was trying to go to medical school, and they wouldn't have drafted him in that case. And it turned out that when he enlisted, that while he was in basic training, they said, "We want you in medical school. In fact, we need you here in the next 10 days or so." And so he wound up getting ill almost immediately after getting that news. And he wound up having a temperature of 102, but he didn't want to talk to anybody about that because he might not make the train to take him back to Richmond. So he kept his mouth shut, and that was not exactly a great move because by the time he passed out and in his unconscious state was checked into the military hospital there in Abilene, Texas, he had a temperature of 106.5. And of course, that's pretty deadly. Not only does it sound deadly? It is deadly. He died for the next 9 minutes after the doctors were trying to care for him in the military hospital there at Fort Barkley in Abilene. So the near-death experience that took place over what we experienced on Earth is 9 minutes is quite a deal. On the next slide, we have a picture of Camp Barkley and a sign out there in front of it that camp usually indicates that it's a smaller instead of a fort, but they had, remember, this is in the midst of World War II, and they had over 60,000 soldiers were on this one camp property. So you can understand that it was almost a city unto itself. So when George finally came to, remember, he passed out with that really high temperature. And when he came to, he actually felt fine, and he just jumped out of bed, and he was looking around the little hospital room that he was in for his clothes because he said, "Man, I got to get myself to Richmond, Virginia for medical school." And he couldn't find anything, and he turned around and he saw that there was someone in the bed that he had just jumped out of. And, it was 2 in the morning. He was a little bewildered anyway. And so he just kind of ignored it, and he ran out into the hallway to see if he could find somebody. And on the next slide, you'll see a depiction of, I'm trying to do the best I can with artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, to be able to bring up these images. Sometimes they do pretty well in matching my description of it, and sometimes they don't. He really just encountered one other person in the hallway, and he had the unpleasant experience that not only did that person ignore him, but it walked directly through his ethereal body. So he was indeed a ghost, even though he still wasn't catching on to what was going on yet. He's like, "Whoa, this guy just rushed, right past me." And so he couldn't get him to deal with it. And so he decides that he needs to get to Richmond just as soon as he can. And the next thing he knows, he is traveling at a tremendous rate of speed, maybe 100 feet above the trees. And so he's traveling east, and he was in Texas, so heading to Virginia is east, but he had no idea if he was going in the right direction or not. So as he was traveling around for a while, he looked down, and next slide will show the picture of a 24-hour restaurant and bar, I guess. They serve beer there with Pabst Blue Ribbon. Neon sign is what he particularly remembered about that. And he said, I think I'll stop there and be able to get directions. And by golly, the next thing you know, he's standing right in front of the entrance to the restaurant. And there's somebody coming in at that early hour and has the same experience with them. That person just completely ignored him and walked on in. And it was right about that time that George started to realize, hey, maybe I'm dead. And that panicked him. And the next thing he knew, instead of flying anywhere else, he found himself immediately back in the hospital room. Now, the thing I want to point out is that when he was thinking that he had to go to Virginia, he was thinking that he had to go by train. And of course, he's flying as this ethereal being through the air, traveling at a high rate of speed, but he was still traveling, you know, physically, if you want to say, traveling over the ground. Whereas when he panicked and he went back to the room, it was instantaneous. He didn't fly back there. He was instantaneously back in the room. He was very fearful. And it was like, God, help me. What's going on here? And it was at that point that we have him encounter Jesus. So he was very fearful, and he starts saying, God, help me. And the next thing you know, Jesus is there, and he could feel nothing but love, unconditional love. He absolutely accepted George as he was, being the young 20-year-old that he was. And then finally, Jesus asked him, what did you do with your life? Now, what was occurring at that point is what many metaphysical circles call a life review, not a last judgment, a life review. And the life review is where we have the opportunity as a soul to look back over all the events that happened in our life, however long it wound up being. And the next slide, I have a depiction of what that might look like. So you have a soldier standing right there who has just passed away, and he's going through a life review, and he has all these scenarios from each moment of his life playing in this big panorama before him. Again, all this happened in 9 minutes in earthly time, but he was able to go through the entire 20 years of his life, not missing a second. And he says, you're able to see this from the point of view, not of my bias or the other person's bias, but of what truly was, how without people acting up or misinterpreting or whatever. He was given the view from the perspective of how things actually occurred and giving you the best lesson to learn out of every event that occurred on the earth. Anyway, when he had that come up, he said, oh, look, I was an Eagle Scout. And that's what he offered to Jesus as to what had you done in your life. And Jesus said, that was for your glorification. He goes, so what do you have in your life to show me now? And George understood. He was getting the lesson that Jesus was trying to get him focused on not his earthly accomplishments, but how much love, how much patience, how much cooperation he was manifesting in the people that he ran into on a day-by-day basis. So in the next slide, it'll depict what it was going on then. It seemed like once George had learned that lesson, Jesus whisked him away to another location. In this case, the location was an office building. And as you can see in the picture over there, it's like you had live human beings and you had ghostly entities, astral beings on the other side that were, they weren't over everyone, but there were a couple of cases that really stuck out that George talked about. And one of them was a gentleman was ordering widgets or whatever it was. And he says, okay, send me 1,000 of those. And the ethereal ghost goes, no, we use those all the time. We'd use up 10,000 of them in a month, order 10,000 and get the price down. So here's this ghost trying to tell the live person what he's doing wrong. The live person is just ignoring him because he doesn't hear him anyway, going on with his life. In another case, they had a woman that was taking a break, and she was smoking a cigarette, and she had a ghostly character right with her who is reaching and trying to grab the cigarette so that she could smoke it. So you're getting an indication there that our habits and our addictions carry over with us. Even if we don't have a physical body, we now have the desire built into us with no ability to kick it physically. So that was kind of an interesting way to go to figure that one out. On the next slide, we what happens after he got those lessons, he gets this huge view from over the earth, and he's just seen all the troubled areas of the world at that time. And it was just really depressing him. And Jesus said, "Keep your eyes on me." And he meant that literally and figuratively, as in if he could focus on Jesus, it wouldn't distract him, and Jesus would be able to continue to show up to him instead of disappearing. And that'll become clear in a few slides from now, but not at this point. He was trying to let him know, keep your focus on me, and you'll be able to learn a whole lot of what's coming on here. The scene changes again, and you can see in the text it talks about a ghostly girl that was following her distraught mother around. That was really a problem because the girl had committed suicide. The mother was distraught, couldn't believe it. And the girl's like, I didn't understand that I wasn't going to be able to come back. And, I was like trying to get away, and then I could just wake up the next day and everything would be fine. Now she's realizing that suicide was not the answer for her at that time. And so, uh, George, once he was able to understand that suicide only leaves you in a position where you are only going to repeat the pattern that got you to the desperate position that said, "I need to commit suicide to get away from this," and you get away from nothing. You just get to repeat the pattern until you get it right. Then he whisked him away again. This time, it kind of sounds like a joke that, Jesus and George walked into a bar, but it wasn't very funny from there because even though it was a riotous living where you had the soldiers drinking and they were smoking and everybody's having a good time. And then you can see on the next slide that there were ethereal beings right in there side by side with the live ones. Now, again, the live ones are not seeing the ghosts, but the ghosts are trying to vicariously live through the people that are in there drinking and smoking, because that was the addiction that the ghosts had when they were on Earth. And they're reaching for a drink, and they're not able to put the drink up to their mouth. They're reaching for the cigarette, and their hand just passes right through it. So they're not able to satisfy their addiction. And then an interesting thing happened because on the next slide, you'll wind up seeing what happened when one of the guys passed out. It shows the guy is out there on the ground, and all of a sudden, you have an ethereal person that goes and actually inhabits the body. It says that he actually inserted the soul through the head of the unconscious man there. Now, it's important to point out that you could literally call that possession. It's not possession as in schizophrenic where an entirely new personality takes over in the next second. I think in this case, he jumps into the body at the point where the guy can't keep him out. The protections of being conscious couldn't keep the ghost out, but he was able to experience the physical form when he was inside the body of what it was like to be drunk. And that's what he was addicted to. And so when I think what happened is when these drunks that would wake up in the morning and feel so hungover, that's not what they're there to feel. And so boom, right away, they're out of the body again. So it's not a possession as in you're going to see the personality change. It's just that the soul goes in there, experiences what they wanted out of it, and then they leave. So it's not a permanent situation. And the next slide we have another depiction of that. As the soldiers would pass out drunk every time, another ethereal soul would come in and take possession of the body. And the interesting thing that George, when he was watching this happen, realized that these ghosts were not only not paying attention to each other, they weren't happy with each other, but they kind of ignored each other, but they didn't even seem to see him or Jesus, let alone you have Jesus, the Christ consciousness, standing right there, and they're not paying any attention to their presence in the room. And that's when he realized that he didn't recognize that Jesus had been standing with him the entire time. And it was only when he panicked and he prayed, "God, help me," that he was back in the hospital, and that Jesus was able to help him not only, calm his fears, but to be able to start showing him what was going to eventually change his whole life after he went through it. So George recognized that this is really what's happening to every soul. If we take our eyes off of Jesus, then we don't recognize that he's there trying to help us the whole time. On the next slide, we'll be able to see that the scene changed, and I'm depicting it with soldiers here, but in fact, it was both genders. They were not necessarily military people, but they were violently going after. I mean, they were trying to kill and do as much maiming, harm, and damage as they could. And the interesting thing is because they were ghosts, they weren't able to inflict any damage on each other at all. It didn't seem to deter their desire for violence. So they just continued to try to fight and kill and scratch and kick and bite, and it didn't matter. They just weren't getting anywhere, and they didn't stop. Once again, they couldn't see either George or Jesus at that point. They just completely ignored them. And then on the next slide, you'll see that George began to see there were even archangels that were right there, gigantic angel presence, but none of them were seeing him. And until they were to do as George did, God help me, that they open their hearts and minds to the help that's available to us at any time, is when they would finally see the angel and it would be able to start being able to help them along. So the interesting thing about this is George started to get the impression that there is on Earth, we have birds of a feather that people tend to, come together that are of a like mind. And it's very true on the other side as well. That, if you're into violence, if you're addicted to cigarettes, addicted to drinking, drugs, whatever, you're going to find those souls that have that same affliction on the other side, and you'll be coming together like that. So it's probably a good idea to not be addicted. On the next slide, we'll see what his next encounter was, and it actually was a much nicer one. George was so impressed. He goes to, this picture doesn't do justice to it because in talking with George personally, he said, just imagine a magnificent building like the Capitol that was just 100 times bigger than that, with these flowing marble stairs that take you up to it. And you wind up having uh, people, the students that were there, were dressed a lot like monks, and they would walk very quietly, and they would go about their business, and they were studying and creating all sorts of scientific experiments that as George looked at each one, it was a concept of science that was well beyond what we have even now, or certainly at the time in 1943. The one thing that he started to notice is they didn't notice him, they didn't notice Jesus, and that they were all working alone. There was no collaboration whatsoever. So you wind up having uh, ignorance, if you will, of incorporating love and patience and cooperation into their day-to-day lives. But they were sure learning about a whole lot of stuff. That as soon as he got that lesson, he was whisked away to the next place, which he actually described. He goes, it sure looked like heaven. And I imagine heaven being much different. This, oddly enough, is a depiction that looks very similar to how Edgar Cayce described Atlantis as concentric circles that were connected by bridges and things like that. So George describes it simply as a city of light, and you can tell that all of the beings there are just pure light, and it is just the most beautiful thing you could possibly imagine. And as they were approaching the city, he could see that there were two light beings that were headed up out of the city. It was almost like they were coming to escort him in. Here's the interesting thing. This is where he was going to end the near-death experience. And I'm going to put my own interpretation on this. This is not how he did it in the book, but I think he reached the Peter principle. He was well beyond the other realms that he had seen, even the scientific one, at the university buildings and all of that. And when he tried to go up to the level of this pure heaven, he had not ascended. He hadn't spiritually grown to the point where he could have entered into there and have it be a good fit. Remember the birds of a feather? So in the Peter principle, if he reached the level of his incompetence, we kind of all have that level that we would be able to do this NDE experience like that. You can only get so far. And all of a sudden, he started feeling his whole essence retracting from that city until, boom, he was right back in the hospital building again. And he's standing next to his body. And he recognized it this time because he looked down and he saw the hand with the ring that he always wore on the hand. And he realized, oh my gosh, that's my body. And the next page, or next slide, you'll see this is really kind of the end of the near-death experience that he had, because it shows, all right, here's this ghostly side of astral being of him reintegrating in with the physical body. And boy, he remembered everything from that near-death experience that was in the book. And that was 1943, and he lived until 2007, went on to become a very successful medical doctor and psychiatrist, and went on to write this book and others. This is not the only book he wrote on the near-death experience that he had. And he wound up having one other experience that you see written up there, in which he just happened to randomly be driving along a highway in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And he looks over to the left and he sees this big Pabst Blue Ribbon neon sign, and he recognizes the restaurant as being the one that he had stopped at and been ignored just before he jetted back to the hospital again, when he realized, oh my gosh, I'm dead. God help me. So he instead of that just being a hallucination, he had the confirmation that that was a real place that he had, flown over, dropped down, stopped, and got ignored. So it's just, instead of it being a dream or, as I said, hallucination, it's kind of confirmed it for him later on. And the next slide, you get to see what George Ritchie looked like toward the end of his life right there. He lived a great life, as I said, just a perfect Southern gentleman, and one of the favorite people I ever met in my life. And finally, the last slide, I want to show you how to get in touch with us, and that's by email, EdgarCaseyAZ, like Arizona, @gmail.com. If you have any questions, suggestions, comments, whatever. And oftentimes I have people that will ask for a PDF copy. So you have separate, the slides, each of them come as a PDF when you ask for that. There's nothing copyrighted in here. So you're able to get that and use it as you desire. And I thank you for watching our book review of Return from Tomorrow.